This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
How long ago was it that I said I was looking into new microphones? At this rate, I should probably give up hope that I'm ever going to replace this dank old piece of junk. I mean, it does the job, but good God, is it annoying when it doesn't work right. Of course, I also say this as I'm currently using a totally outdated MacBook Pro from 2015. It's crazy to think this thing's held up for the last 10 years. My old HP barely lasted 5 before it started to break down and have issues. I don't think I'd ever go back to using Windows ever again. It took me long enough to learn how to use the Mac functions. I don't want to go back now. Anyhow, things seem to be working okay now. So we can get rolling with this Friday show. Welcome, everybody. What's going on? I'm going to talk about some classic wrestling on today's show. The returning subscribers already know that. But for all the newbies checking out the program for the first time, make sure y'all subscribe, comment, give the show a like if you don't mind. We are the Five Starr Wrestling Report, the very humble wrestling podcast that nobody knows but everybody needs. Here on YouTube and Rumble, Mondays and Fridays to spread the good word on classic wrestling and other assorted things. WWE PLEs whenever those come up. I've already touched on what we'll be discussing on Monday's show. I wanted to expand on the John Cena heel turn conversation and bring some more clarity to the table. I think more people are starting to come down from the glorious high. Now they're starting to use common sense and rationality to form their opinions. Like, hey, maybe we're giving him a little too much credit here. I mean, this might not be as great as we're hoping. But we'll get into all that on Monday. For this week, we got enough classic footage to cover a good hour and a half of programming here, so let's dive in. Sorry, I'm just double checking to make sure my mic's not cutting out. I think we're good. Okay. NWA 6:05 on the Superstation. Or actually, it's 7:05 now. Keep forgetting about that. I've got nothing for a cold open. I'm just going to start from the top of the show. When I saw JR and Magnum preview the card for the week, I was like, oh boy, it's going to be one of those shows, isn't it? Show was. This was one of those 2-hour episodes where if you look up the term slog in the dictionary, this episode of Saturday Night WCW would be screen capped right beside the word. It was a 2-hour show that may as well have been 12. Mentally, it seemed like it. Well, we start this week with the Varsity Club coming out for a promo. Kevin Sullivan is wearing what I can only best describe as a dad sweater. For any of you that know older men that wear cardigans or pullovers, You know what I'm talking about. And a lot of what happened here was a reflection on the story they set up last week. Mike Rotunda is going to be putting up his television title in addition to $10,000. And so when he goes to open the leather briefcase, you see what appears to be 10 grand. It's always hard to decipher without physically breaking up the bills and counting everything out. To be fair, they're heels. I wouldn't put it past them to be fibbing the amount of money they were carrying around. It's funny, though, because Sullivan kind of let the cat out of the bag. The fact that the 10 grand is actually split amongst all team members of the varsity club, so it doesn't all belong to Mike Rotunda. JR's like, now wait a minute here. I thought the clause was that the money would be coming out of Rotunda's pocket. Then Rotunda, ever the team player, just goes, my money is our money, Jim. So he's an honorable douchebag. And they throw all the money in a plastic bowl. Rotunda starts jaw-jacking with all the fans, asking if they've ever seen this amount of money in their lives. You could hear a bunch of girls in the crowd go, yeah. Just totally exposing themselves as gold diggers, no doubt. Either that or prostitutes. And, well, I have nothing else to add. Other than me fixating on how clueless Dan Spivey looked through the entire segment, he had that deer in the headlights 1,000-yard stare going on. I guarantee they just told him to go out there and look menacing. Don't speak, don't engage, just stand there and be tall and useless. Which is pretty much all Spivey was ever good for. From there, we had the Midnights taking on Bob Cook and the Raider. I need to know where the hell Jim Cornette bought those bright red tennis shoes he wore this week. Someone needs to send an email to the Corny drive-thru account and ask if he still owns those things. They were both dazzling and hideously obnoxious. You could really tell how banged up Bobby Eaton was when you go back and watch this. He was visibly limping through the whole match. God love him, though. He still went out there and wrestled the Bobby Eaton style. But boy, was he hurting. Fine work from the Midnights. Their opponents were two left-footed deer on ice skates. But it was all right. Bobby and Stan pinned Cook with a double flapjack. Again, that was where you could really tell that Bobby wasn't at 100% here. I mean, he looked like he was in so much pain just trying to stand up after giving the move. It did make me question why he would even bother attempting a top rope leg drop when he was that physically banged up. But hey, it's Bobby Eaton. Even at 50%, that guy could still outwork just about everybody on the roster up to that point. They also did a quick promo at the podium, talking about Paulie and the Samoan SWAT team. Stan actually did the bulk of the talking here, believe it or not. Basically did a compare and contrast on what it's like when the Midnights are hanging out on the beach versus the Samoans. How the Samoans are usually climbing trees and rubbing twigs together to make firewood. Meanwhile, the Midnights are rubbing suntan lotion on pretty girls and then fucking them. Well, Stan was at least. I can't speak for Bobby. I know he was happily married at the time. Then Corny finished it out by telling Paul that the Midnights aren't afraid of two frizzy-haired freaks from Gilligan's Island. Talked about how Paul is so desperate to be a Jim Cornette knockoff. Now he's gone and bought himself an entire interview segment and a bodyguard just like he used to have. And I didn't quite catch what he said at the end because the people were kind of drowning him out. I believe it was something to the effect of, the Midnights are going to be knocking on Paul and the Samoans' front door very soon. And just to make sure you can't escape, we're going to backdoor all of you at the same time. Was that a cock joke? Did we just hear Jim threaten to anally probe Paulie dangerously and the Samoans on the Turner Network? I mean, I know Stan was into the ladies, but hell, I didn't know he was willing to get that freaky. That was a weird ending to the promo. And then we came back for the Iron Sheik versus George South, in progress, which had to have been a cognitive decision on the network's part. They're probably like, how much of this TV match can we possibly edit out so the viewers at home don't have to experience it? Well, unfortunately, for the 2 minutes we did see air, it was still 2 minutes too many. Let's just say, the best offensive move that Sheik pulled off in this match was an abdominal stretch. A move that required him to merely remain in a stationary standing hold. The rest of it was utter garbage. God, by the time it was over, I thought they were going to have to call the authorities just to cart Sheiky out of the fucking ring. He was gasping for air by the end of this thing. I don't think I've ever seen that much perspiration on a human being for only having wrestled 2, maybe 3 minutes tops. Horrible. You know what else is horrible? This Danger Zone talk segment with Paulie and Lex Luger. Well, actually, let me put a label on that. It was horrible for the first several minutes where it was just Heyman and Luger going back and forth. And then once Michael Hayes crashed the party, got a million times better. Not for the reasons you're thinking, though. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me talk about the segment first, and then I'll share some of my Luger thoughts. He's been at the center of some big media attention this week with WWE announcing his upcoming Hall of Fame induction. So I want to give him his flowers. The interview with Luger and Heyman here was very bland and not exceptionally compelling. Paul's basically being a dick the entire time, passively congratulating Luger on becoming the United States Heavyweight Champion, even though Barry Windham still has a valid claim on being the current champ. And they very briefly touched on that before Paul turned his focus over to Luger's upcoming match in the Omni, where we learned for the first time ever he will be teaming with Michael Hayes. And like I said, this is where things really picked up. You want to talk about diametrically opposite on-screen personalities teaming Lex Luger and Michael P.S. Hayes together. Even in the short term, you're like, there's no possible way these guys could have any chemistry together, right? They are way too dissimilar from the other, which is why it was so perfect. Because it came into play here. Hayes runs out and starts working the crowd, doing this outgoing, rambunctious promo. He's trying to amp up Luger and get him excited because after they finish their match in the Omni, they're going to go hang out and ride the nightlife. Get themselves some Atlanta Babe action, you know what I'm saying? And you just watch Luger's expression the entire time. He is so visibly uncomfortable. He's like Dear God, please end this fucking segment. It is so great. And I instantly knew the minute they made this announcement that Luger and Hayes were going to be teaming together, I was like, oh, that sounds like a boatload of fun. Because you absolutely know Luger is not going to be down for it. And the prophecy came true. Here he was with Hayes on camera. And he was not feeling it, Mr. Krabs. He wanted out. It did get momentarily personal when Paulie tried to ask Hayes if him teaming with Luger makes him an honorary member of the Freebirds. And then immediately, on a dime, Hayes' mood completely changes. He looks at Paul deadpan and goes, "No. The Freebirds have gone their own separate ways. Luger's his own man. And Paul better not mention the Freebirds again if he knows what's good for him." Duly noted. But hey, in completely unrelated news, hey, Luger, we're going to go party hardy in Atlanta tomorrow night. He just goes right back to being babyface Michael Hayes again. He was so great. And there were some other things they talked about here. Paul wanted Luger to take off his tracksuit and pose for the fans, since he thinks flexing and posing is what wins him matches. And Luger did have a good comeback when he said, "Well, it won me the U.S. heavyweight title." He's not wrong. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it, Paulie. Getting back to the current news about Luger, though, I was watching a couple of those DDP workout vlogs they were doing together. I think in the most recent one, it was Luger's second or third trip back to DDP's place. I mean, they've been going at this for a long time. It's really difficult for me to watch anything of Luger post-retirement. All the health issues, the obvious emotional toll it's taken on him. It's really heavy stuff if you listen to him do interviews or talk about everything he's battled over the years. Drugs and alcohol, losing touch with his kids, not being in the best frame of mind during the prime stages of his career. I mean, he's basically been wheelchair bound for, what, going on 10 years? Maybe a bit longer. And I think I recently read, with him going through this DDP treatment program, he has been able to regain temporary motion in certain parts of his body that he really didn't have control over following the stroke and the spinal nerve damage. I think he's also been able to stand for short periods, which is wonderful news to hear. You know, especially with him going into the Hall of Fame class this year. Man, you want to talk about truly inspirational figures in the business? Diamond Dallas Page, man. That guy is a class act. He is somebody that you genuinely know wants to help people. And not for any kind of monetary or profit gain. Just because he's a good man. And I always like DDP as a worker, but seeing what he's able to do with his yoga program and the workout sessions, you know, bringing people on board and just talking about health and life and how to improve themselves, I really have gained a new kind of appreciation for him as a person. And you know for a fact that Luger is totally grateful for everything Page has done to help him. I mean, you see it in the interview. He's just a totally different human being now. Can you imagine how iconic it'll be if Luger's able to walk out to his Hall of Fame speech and do it standing from the podium? I mean, it ain't too often you'll hear a guy like me say it's enough to make you want to cry. But I won't blame you for all shedding a tear over something like that. You know, especially for somebody like me who grew up watching Luger and really liked him as a talent. Fuck the John Cena heel turn, dude. That would be hands down the best moment in wrestling in all of 2025. Just to see Luger be able to stand to deliver his Hall of Fame speech. If only they could get the Stinger to induct him. Not holding my breath there. You're dealing with petty Tony Khan in that case. Anyway, getting back to the show. Not that anything else is going to supersede what we just talked about with Luger. Mike Rotunda wrestled Cougar Jay for the television title, as well as the 10 grand. I liked how they had a stationary camera set on the giant fishbowl with the money in it. Just casually sitting out in the open studio with nobody safeguarding it. I guess Sullivan and Spivey were in close proximity. Not close enough to alleviate the idea that some crazy person would try to run over and steal it. Anyway, boring match. I nearly fell asleep watching it. The best part was when Cougar Jay took a mulky bump out to the concrete and splattered like a pancake. All I could think the whole time this was going on, though, this has to obviously be leading to something in storyline, right? I mean, you don't do something this meticulous when it comes to weekly TV title challenges and putting up $10,000 unless the payoff is one of the top babyfaces coming in to upset the heel. And if I recall correctly, I think they end up having Sting win the belt relatively soon. I just don't remember if it's a direct result of the storyline they're doing with the Varsity Club or if it's something entirely different. And so far, it's just job guys answering the challenge. But it has to lead to something eventually. I'm also saying this during a time in the NWA where things were randomly shifting from week to week with no explanation. Consistency was not this company's MO around this time. Going back to the interview podium, we had Ric Flair out to talk about still being on the path to reclaiming the World Heavyweight title. In addition, he's also eyeing the U.S. Heavyweight title. So they used to carry that belt around with pride. And that there's nothing Flair would like more than to take the belt from Luger on his journey to beating Steamboat to recapture the World Heavyweight title. And, well, then he plugged his big announcement, which he did not make here, nor did he make it any other point in the program, but I'll cover that a bit later on. He was also scheduled to wrestle this week. Meanwhile, here he is decked out in a custom black suit for what was basically a 90-second nothing promo. I will continue to ask this question every week until somebody can give me a valid answer. Why the fuck is Hiro Matsuda out there? What is his purpose? He does nothing. He stands in the background. That's it. They were paying this guy to literally be a body. Did I mention this company went out of business eventually? Sting wrestled Julio Barrera in a hilariously bad match that was so bad, I actually went back and rewatched it again. And it actually didn't start off too terrible, which was arguably one of the most amazing parts about it. The first couple minutes was just kind of your basic stinger squash where he runs wild and slams dudes around, fires up the crowd. And then we get the spot where Sting goes to throw a drop kick on the double-chinned Barry Darso. This fat fuck Julio Barrera. Well, okay, first of all, let me back up. When Sting went to throw this drop kick, he was at least a good 6 inches away from him. Nowhere close to Julio's face. So the drop kick already looked horrendous. But Julio sells this goddamn thing like he just got blistered with a cannon shot. He goes ass over tea kettle, over the top rope, runs full speed toward the first 2 or 3 rows of the studio crowd. You can see everybody's lives flash in front of their eyes as they realize this giant freight train of a human being is coming barreling toward them. You actually can see an older lady take off running, probably cursing to herself. She was not a happy camper. That was a true fight or flight moment for that broad. Probably tried to sue the network afterwards. And seriously, that was the only thing I could think after seeing that spot. One of these motherfuckers is going to sue the Turner Network for an unsafe work environment. Keep in mind, we're not talking, say, 1 or 2 people whose lives were in jeopardy. This was literally an entire side of studio fans that were put in harm's way. And this Julio Barrera was not going to stop. So, of course, Sting goes over to check and make sure everybody's okay. Probably legitimately trying to cool down the situation, knowing that the people were hot. And, well, the match continues. By that point, everybody was thrown off their game. Julio was tired because he was fat and out of shape. Sting was psychologically thrown off. The crowd almost died as a result of this match. So they do some more bad wrestling until Sting finally won with a Stinger Splash and a Scorpion Deathlock. If you have the Peacock subscription, you have to go watch this Sting Julio Barrera match from the March 11th, 1989 episode of the Superstation program, mainly for the spot I just covered. If this is the last time we ever see Julio Barrera in the NWA, I would not be shocked in the slightest. And then we had our advertised Ric Flair match. And he wrestled a real top-of-the-line talent this week. Somebody that people were saying could have been the future of wrestling in the 90s. I mean, we're talking elite-level talent, brother. This guy could have been big. Just didn't pan out. He wrestled Greg Evans. Yeah, sad to say, Greg never made it big. But he had potential in some other unspecified dimension of the world. Of all people, Ric fucking Flair was advertised a week in advance to wrestle on the Saturday TBS show. The best you could do for him was Greg Evans? Where the hell was Mike Jackson at this week? Could have booked him in this match. At least it would have been good and fun. No joke. This had to have been the most boring Ric Flair match of all time. I can count on one hand the amount of Ric Flair matches that I've ever seen that effectively put me to sleep the longer it went. And this was it. Dude, it just went on and on and on and on. Flair's working over the guy's knee, and he's stomping on the knee over and over again. And eventually he goes, "Now it's time to go to school." At which point I'm like, oh, great. He's finally going to take it home. Nope. He just fucking works over the leg some more. At no point is a crowd cheering for Evans to make a comeback. They're just kind of sitting there quietly watching as Flair's working over a dude's leg for an hour. Finally, he slaps on the figure four for the submission. Then afterwards, he kept the hold applied so he could get some heat on himself. And that part was fine. At least there was actual action happening in that sequence, as opposed to just watching Flair stomp on a guy's hamstring for 5 goddamn years. Objectively, and I say this with the utmost respect and regard for Ric Flair as a performer and a talent, on my Mount Rushmore of faces of professional wrestling, I would probably put Flair amongst those top guys. This may have been the worst match I've ever seen him have. I didn't watch that retirement match he had with Andrade and whatever venue that match took place in. I think it was the tag where him and Andrade wrestled Jay Lethal and someone else I can't remember. It was the one where Flair supposedly passed out several times during the match and had trouble getting through it. And I don't need to have that be my lasting memory of seeing Ric Flair in any kind of physical capacity. So, removing that from the equation, this was easily the worst Flair match I've ever seen. Now, granted, we have another 20 plus years of history when it comes to Flair's in-ring career. I'm sure he's had a handful of blunders in WCW and WWE during that period. But at least in terms of everything that predated the year 1990, you can pin this one at the top of the list of worst Ric Flair matches of all time. Him versus Gary Evans on the March 11th, 1989 Superstation program. Or whatever the guy's fucking name was. Gary, Gus, Greg. Who gives a shit? He sucked. And so did this match. So then Flair went over to the podium to basically reiterate everything he talked about in his promo earlier. Only now he was sweaty, fired up, and maxed out on testosterone. Called out Luger and Steamboat. Said he's coming for both their belts, and that was basically it. Talked about how Steamboat arrived back in the United States from his tour in Japan, where he was making $100,000 off of Flair's back, stealing his income and stealing his spotlight. But his main point was that everybody in the world, up to and including Steamboat's family, know that he still has to prove that what happened at the Chi-Town Rumble wasn't a fluke. To prove that he was really the better man. And now we come to the important part of the conversation. For those of you that are trying to follow consistency on the timeline here, the big announcement that Flair advertised last week, the one that he was saving because for whatever reason he couldn't just reveal on Paulie's talk show, he had to save the big announcement for this week. Well, what was the announcement, you ask? I have no idea. I don't think he ever made one. if the big announcement was, I'm going to take out Luger and win the U.S. title on my road to beating Steamboat for the World Heavyweight title, it's kind of a lackluster announcement. That's what you had saved for this week? You had to withhold that information for 7 days just to reveal that you're going to fight Luger? Some people may call that big news. You know what I call that in the industry? False advertising. Moving on. Barry Windham beat Gator Gilmore with a superplex in 2 minutes. And then he cut a very dark, foreboding promo on Luger, saying the next time he gets to wrestle him, he's going to scrub the mat with Luger's pretty little head and show that Windham is still the uncrowned U.S. heavyweight champion. He also referred to Magnum here as Terry Allen. So you know how serious he was. He used his shoot name, brother. That's when you know the boys mean business. When they break that K-fob. By the way, do we actually ever see that rematch? Fuck if I know. I'm still not entirely sure why Barry's even still wrestling when we know he's basically gone from the company by the end of the month. Maybe even before that. Probably in the next couple weeks. Tape delay always screws everything up. Messes with your head. Let's see, what else did we have on this forgettable TV episode? We had an Eddie Gilbert Rick Steiner promo that was all kinds of chaotic and incomprehensible. Not because of anything they said, but the fact that there was no real coherency to anything going on here. At the same time, he got Steiner talking about still being the TV champion, even though he's not. And something about the $10,000, I didn't really follow what was going on there. Meanwhile, Eddie's doing one of those really forced, passionate babyface promos where you can kind of tell he doesn't really have anything to say. But if he just screams everything really loudly into the mic and shows passion, then it should get a reaction out of people. It's pretty much what all that was. It's like an MJF promo, except it had the inverse effect. MJF's a heel who just screams his entire way through a promo. Eddie Gilbert was supposed to be a babyface when he was doing this. Then we went to the ring for Kevin Sullivan and Dan Spivey versus Mike Thor and Morgan Vastine. Or Vastine. Sucked. Well, more accurately, Dan Spivey sucked. And because he did the bulk of the work for the heels, that meant he was the culprit for why this match sucked so bad. The closing minutes were absolutely impeccable. Think about how often I used to sit here and lambaste AEW for all the stupid, goofy indie finishes they came up with over the years. You know, where you have guys doing all these dangerous, high-risk moves that should reasonably be enough to kill somebody, much less end a fucking wrestling match. And then the actual finish is like a roll-up or a standing clothesline. Something totally generic and lame. Fucking Dan Spivey gives Morgan Vastine 4 consecutive jackknife power bombs. And of course, the idea here is that Sullivan's cheering him on and calling him for him to do the move several times just to get it over, which is fine. I mean, it's not to say any of these power bombs looked good in execution, because they weren't. They were like the sloppy ones Diesel used to give in the WWF, where he just picked the guy up about halfway and then drop him to his side like a wet sandbag. Looked terrible. I mean, I was just glad he didn't drop the guy on the back of his neck and kill him. So, 4 power bombs in a row. Pretty big move, traditionally speaking. I mean, the power bomb used to be a stable finish in wrestling. Guess what the finish of this match was? A standing bear hug. Dude, I'm not kidding you. I almost turned the show off right then and there. We still had like 20 minutes left. This was almost my breaking point. I was like, I cannot endure another 20 minutes of having to sit through this. This dumb motherfucker, this blonde meathead, just powerbombed a dude 4 times in a row. And he decided it's not good enough. I've got a better idea for a finish. I'll put him in a bear hug. I will hold him in a stationary move. And then I'll make him give up. Remember when the show used to be good? A couple months ago? Yeah, it's not going in a good direction. By the way, on the topic of Gilbert and Steiner, didn't I mention something last week about them just randomly teaming up together for no discernible reason? Apparently that wasn't a one-time thing. Just go ahead and add that to the list of random pile of shit that Eddie Gilbert was involved with and never went anywhere. They wrestled Max Miles and Trent Knight this week. I think JR provided a little clarity to the $10,000 thing from that promo earlier. Apparently Steiner mentioned something about not knowing what he would do with 10 grand if he had it. To which I said, you know, that's probably for the better that Steiner doesn't have it then. If you cannot rationally figure out what to do with $10,000, you shouldn't be able to access your own bank account. Albeit match is pretty fun. Mostly just for watching Steiner be a goofball the entire time. He had a couple highlights here. My favorite was the part where Eddie was wrestling with Miles. He's got him down in some kind of weird-looking stretch hold. And he has him turned over on his side, but his arms are being extended over his head, so he can't defend himself. Steiner just reaches in and starts pulling in Max Miles' chest hair. Then like a minute later, he goes out to the floor and starts heckling one of the cameramen. I think it was actually Tommy Edwards. And then eventually he tagged in and won with the belly-to-belly. The only thing I can presume, when you look at the dynamics of this pairing, because I remember Missy becoming the on-screen manager for the Steiners later on this year, my presumption is that maybe the pairing with Eddie Gilbert was a storyline utilization or a storyline tool. I mean, it seems a little convenient that he got Missy out there interacting with Rick Steiner, and then in the same year, she ends up becoming his manager on television, as well as his kayfabe girlfriend. Actually, no, I got that wrong. It was Scott who she became the girlfriend of. Rick was paired with Nancy. Again, though, all these strange phenomena that were taking place in '89. Like, I remember certain stories and angles, but having a hard time trying to connect the dots to remember how it all goes down. Then we came back with the Varsity Club out for a second promo. I love this line of questioning from JR. He goes, "Have you guys forgotten how to pin someone?" And I was sitting there like, since when is the bear hug an illegal hold? Pretty sure that was a valid submission move. Why is Jim so bent out of shape over it? Anyway, they basically recapped everything we saw from them earlier. Sullivan put over Rotunda, said he did what he promised he'd do. Since he is the captain of the varsity club, it's only fitting that the $10,000 came directly from Rotunda's pocket. Lie. He then tried to refer to him as Captain Rotunda. Ugh. Don't remind me. It's a bad omen of things to come. Again, I'm not crazy, right? We did establish earlier on that the 10 grand was split amongst everybody in the group. I didn't dream that, right? I do not watch this show on drugs, I promise. Although I probably should. I mean, sometimes I zone out when I watch these programs, but I heard that plain as day. I get it, though, they're heels. They're supposed to fib. Rest of the promo largely sucked. They had the right idea earlier when they had Spivey just standing in the backdrop being a mute. God, this time they let him talk for a few minutes. And it was every bit as horrible as one could possibly imagine. He said there are two universal truths about the varsity club. They're good, and they know it. Great. So not only does Spivey suck at promos, we also now know that MJF stole his fucking catchphrase. By the way, sidebar here. Since I've already referenced him and AEW a couple times in this review already, can I just say, if there's any modern pro wrestler that I've completely shifted opinions on in terms of anything remotely good to say about them, it's MJF. I don't know what the fuck happened in the last couple years. I am so done putting over that guy. The minute he decided to re-sign with AEW and hitch his wagon to that sinking ship, that guy's stock has rapidly fallen off a cliff. And it just continues to get worse and worse and worse and worse. The best thing for that dude is just to get the hell out of that place and try to go to WWE to savor whatever's left of his tanking career. Unfortunately, I think he might have already ingested the toxic Kool-Aid. He may be past the point of return. We had Butch Reed versus Joe Cruz. I believe this was Hiro Matsuda's 5th appearance on this show. And he was still about as useful as a paraplegic in a house fire. Butch Reed did some stuff for a few minutes and won with a flying shoulder block. I love Butch Reed, but we were over an hour into the show and I was beyond an ability to give a fuck by this point. Then the Samoans battled Randy Mulkey and Bob Emery. Two things to say about this. I actually didn't mention it earlier, but they had an inset promo for Ranger Ross during one of the other matches on the show. They basically ran it back a second time and re-aired it here. It was a 10-second clip where he talked about the stiff competition in the NWA. And that was it. And it kind of hit me during that moment. Ranger Ross. That is a name that I have not thought about in years. I don't remember much about him. I remember the gimmick sucked. Another one of those Jim Herd brain children that didn't get over. Funny enough, I actually remember less about his wrestling career than I now do about his criminal history. And that was merely because of listening to a Jim Cornette podcast a couple years ago where him and Brian Last talked about him going to prison for a bank robbery in whatever town or city it was in Georgia. In terms of his actual in-ring career, does anybody remember a thing about him? I mean, he basically floated around mid-card purgatory. I vaguely recall him doing something with Ron Simmons. I think they were a team briefly and then feuded. And that would have had to have been right before they kickstarted Doom. Because that's also coming up pretty soon. Him and Butch Reed. But he never really did much in terms of having any standout programs or feuds. He was mostly there to just elevate the bigger names. But yeah, Ranger Ross coming to WCW alongside the Vincent Youngs and the Norman the Lunatics and the Ding Dongs of the world. That's something else I wanted to mention here, but I completely forgot. Got sidetracked ranting about Ranger Ross. Oh, I remember. Randy Mulkey. Yeah, it was fun watching him bump around here for the Samoans. That had to be intentional. They were like, who the fuck do we have that can sell Fatu and Samu's offense effectively? How about Randy Mulkey? He always takes a good ass beating. And he absolutely did here. He took a beating and then some. Samu dropped him right on the back of his neck with a middle rope backdrop. Then they hit their signature splash for the 3. Then Paulie did a quick promo at the booth to put over the Samoans. I should say, putting them over to the best extent that he could. This is so wacky. There's like 100 different things happening in this one shot, and all of it is just glorious train wreck television. In addition to Paul getting totally blocked by Fatu's giant head while he's in the middle of his promo, the Samoans are fucking around with Paulie's cell phone and drooling and slobbering all over the place. Fatu's playing around with JR's format. Meanwhile, there's Secret Service agent Jack Victory in the background just being a giant void of nothing. I'm like, what is happening here? Why is Paulie managing the Samoans? Why the fuck is Jack Victory a Secret Service agent? Why is any of this taking place? To which I simply say, it's WCW. Which you can basically coin as a euphemism to describe every possible thing that went wrong with this company over the next 12 years before they finally went under. And then we closed it out with, why not? A 6-man tag with JYD, Michael Hayes, and Vincent Young versus the Kroll Connection and Rip Morgan. It was all hands on deck by this point. Match went approximately 1 minute and ended with Hayes pinning one of the Kroll Connection with a DDT. And I think Hayes got jealous because Dog was dancing with Vincent Young. Either that or was a clash in musical taste. Yeah, this show was awful. That was a real struggle to get through. Good to know it only gets worse from here. So on that wonderfully happy note, how about we talk about a show that wasn't awful? Midsouth television, baby. Let's go. Or what does Pat McAfee's theme say? Let's go. Actually, I had a former colleague I used to work with at a music store that would always say that. Good dude. I miss working with him. So this week, as the pressuring tide continues to shift in the Wrestling 2 Magnum TA story, there's nobody better suited to talk about pressure than Cowboy Bill Watts. He was going full bore and getting over the internal pressure between their tag team. He read an entire 4-page preamble to explain what's been going on between these two as of late. Good on him for getting over the importance of the story, but geez, Bill. Got a 45-minute window to work with here. You don't need to read the entire phone book cover to cover in one sitting. All kidding aside, we know the main issue with these two. Mr. Wrestling 2 is envious of the fact that Magnum TA was granted a North American title shot ahead of him. He's been looking for every excuse to belittle and bash him. And we saw a lot of tension come to the forefront last week. Not only when Wrestling 2 slapped Magnum and then called him a coward for wanting to step aside and hand deliver his title shot to Wrestling 2 on a silver platter, but then later in that same program, we had Wrestling 2 getting involved during the Magnum TV title match with Crusher Khrushchev, the former Crusher Darso. Right when Magnum had reversed the upside-down backbreaker and had Darso in a pinning predicament, 2 threw in the proverbial white towel to signal that Magnum was quitting, and that he had no fight left in him. And that's precisely what 2 claimed in this promo with Watts and Magnum, saying that he was doing what's right. Magnum couldn't fight anymore. He was saying, I quit when Khrushchev had him in that hold. So to save not only the embarrassment of him, but Wrestling 2, the prick he is, 2 had the ref stop the match. Now, of course, and correctly so, Watts points out here that 2 stories changed in the last week. Now, a week ago, 2 made no mention of Magnum quitting in that match. The claim was that he threw in the towel because he was trying to save Magnum from the beating he was receiving. But now 2 is adding in this wrinkle about Magnum being a quitter. And everybody obviously knows it's all bullshit. So Magnum retorts and says, I'm no quitter. And Wrestling 2 knows that. From the day they started training together, Magnum's never quit on anything. And he sure as hell wasn't quitting in his match with Khrushchev. In fact, Magnum knows exactly why 2 did what he did. He knew that Magnum could have gone the distance in the TV title tournament, and that was a direct threat to Wrestling 2's ego. So he wanted to make sure Magnum didn't succeed out of spite. Because he knows what's going on here. He's not stupid. And now this is where things are really getting heated between these two. You had Wrestling 2 threatening to slap Magnum a 4th time, since he hasn't had the courage to fight back the last 3 times he attempted. So when 2 goes to lift his hand at Magnum, you see Magnum grab him by the wrist and finally be an abrasive babyface, standing up to this egomaniacal coach and giving him a verbal lashing himself. And of course, this part was great. Magnum's all fired up now. So he challenges 2 to a fight, since, well, that's exactly what Wrestling 2 wanted the other week. Of course, Magnum didn't have the spirit to accept the challenge because he wasn't in the right frame of mind. But now that the tables turn, now that it's Magnum issuing the challenge, well, now Wrestling 2's having second thoughts. Like the coward he is. He's saying, nah. See, if I go in there and whoop his ass right now, he's going to have a ton of excuses for not being ready and not being prepared. You want the fight so bad? Get Grizzly Smith to put it in writing. And then I'll be happy to sign a contract. Then, of course, he saunters off while Magnum's standing in the ring with his fists clenched. And what makes this whole thing amazing, you don't even really think about it until you see it all unfold. These two are still the current Midsouth Tag Team Champions. They have done such a tremendous job building up the feud between these two on camera. You often still forget the fact that they're the current reigning Mid-South Tag Champs. Nobody's beaten them for the belts yet. And how many times have we seen Magnum come out here and say, look, we're still a unit. We're still the champions. I don't want this to go any further. I'm trying to be the better man here. Let's look the other way and handle this like men. Put our differences aside for the greater cause. But Wrestling 2's been stirring the pot week after week. It's great. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, you obviously want to see them fight one another. It's what this is all building to. But there is that layer where you think, well, they are still technically a tag team. So maybe it would be better for them to put their differences aside and shake hands. Keeps you guessing. And that's why it's such a memorable all-time feud. So then we came back for Crusher Khrushchev and Nikolai Volkov versus Joe Savoldi and John King. Still going to take me a minute to consciously call him Khrushchev as opposed to Darso. I still have to think about it. Yet again, another week goes by where Reeser Bowden's going to Reeser Bowden all over this fucking show. He has to try to play dumb when Nikolai asks for the house mic and requests to sing the Russian national anthem. Like it's not something we've seen him do in every match over the last 2 months. But Reeser's like, oh, of course. How silly of me. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand as Nikolai sings the Russian national anthem. And he stands in front of the Russians with his hands folded like a giant tool. Just totally no-selling everything and rolling along with the punches. I did find it funny when they were doing the crowd shots and showing a couple people waving American flags around. You had the one asshole with the British flag printed on a t-shirt trying to boo the Russians. It's like the middle school reject that doesn't fit in with any particular peer group. So he tries to force his way into a group and nobody actually wants him around. I was like, yeah, your country's a joke too, my friend. Go sip your tea and read Karl Marx. Really nothing to say about the match aside from the awesome finish where Nikolai gave King a back body drop into Khrushchev, who then caught him effortlessly in the over-the-shoulder backbreaker. Seamless. The only other team in wrestling history I ever saw pull that off was Megan the Barbarian in WCW. I was glad to hear JR mention that he too had trouble remembering to refer to him as Crusher Khrushchev, as opposed to Darso. Makes me a little more at ease knowing I'm not the only one struggling. And that took us to the TV title tournament round for the week. It's a big one. It is the first of our second round matches. Yes, we are only now entering the second round of the tournament. A tournament that I believe has now been going on for as long as dinosaurs were roaming the earth. I think before they crucified Jesus Christ himself, this tournament was still in existence. Good Christ. Anyway, it's Terry Taylor versus Masayo Ito. They actually shot an angle to hype this up a few weeks back. I don't even know if anyone would remember it offhand. They never showed a replay. It was during that mass brawl where all the baby faces and heels were going at it. Then you had Taylor and Ito fighting on the floor at one point. So here we are a month later. Time to blow it off. And no, the last few minutes were pretty good. The rest of it was kind of boring and uneventful. Not that it was bad, I just don't really know if I needed to see Masayo Ito put Terry Taylor in a stomach claw for 5 goddamn years. I mean, Taylor is a good babyface in peril, but he's not Ricky Morton in terms of milking the facial expressions. But it was fine for what it was designed to do. The ending was great, though, because you had them do the ref bump where after he and Taylor collide, Ito throws Taylor over the top rope to the floor. And then while Ito has his back turned to argue with the official, Taylor, you kind of see him crawling under the ring so he can sneak to the other side. And then it's the old babyface outsmarting the heel maneuver where he slides into the ring and then does a flash roll-up for the pin. Crowd popped big for that. Classic babyface move in wrestling. I wish we saw more of that stuff today. I mean, these days if somebody did that, it would be a near fall. Plus, you really think about it, do babyfaces and heels really exist? I think it's considered blasphemy when you bring up the babyface heel conversation in wrestling now. Or at least that's what I hear from The Rock. And as we all know, Rock's word is gospel truth. And then we return for a classic. Arguably not considered a classic at the first time of viewing. But when you look back through history and you analyze how legendary their feud became, it all traces back to here. It is the first ever televised showdown between the Midnight and the Rock and Roll Express. And you knew as a fan at the time, the program was evident. 2 tag teams calling themselves an Express, 1 babyface, 1 heel. You couldn't forego that program altogether. At some point, you knew they would clash. And so here's Jim Cornette to lay out the gauntlet from the beginning, poking fun at Ricky and Robert, saying they look like a couple Valley girls trying to make a name at the Midnight's expense. And that's why today, Bobby and Dennis are going to teach those 2 punks a lesson in respect. It is kind of crazy when you think this match went totally unadvertised. They just threw that one out there in the open and said, let's pair them up and see what happens. Well, a lot happened, as a matter of fact. What happened is it became the greatest tag team rivalry of all time. You could take Brunzell and Greg Gagne versus Ventura and Adonis and blow it out your ass. Stan Lane and Steve Curran versus the original Sheepherders. Please. Hardys and the Dudleys. Oh, my brother, get the fuck out of here. You want me to keep going? I could. Steamboat Youngblood and the Funk Brothers. British Bulldogs, Hart Foundation. Now, still might not be as good as the Beta Bucks and the Lucha Fucks. I don't know. It's a lot of angry internet marks to get stirred up all at once. I don't know if I want to go down that rabbit hole. Seriously, though, what a phenomenal tag match. I mean, it's impossible to review every single solitary detail. We'd be dissecting the action for the next 8 weeks. This is one of those moments that gets often overlooked in wrestling, even though it kind of signified something monumental for the future, which is understandable. I mean, how many people truly remember the first ever matchup between The Rock and Roll and Midnight Express? Aside from Cornette, because he documented everything on paper. But for the audience, it was just a cold TV match in the middle of a Midsouth taping block. Not a whole lot of fanfare. But when you saw these teams collide, you knew in that moment, oh yeah, we got something big we can do with this. And they gave you just enough action here to whet your appetite and say, man, if you thought this was good, think about what these guys can actually do when there's a backstory and heat. And we give them time to work with. The crowd was super into everything that was going on here. It's all action from bell to bell. Everybody working hard, doing as much as they could to keep the people engaged. You had the great flurry of offense from The Rock and Roll in the early goings. Midnights are getting outclassed and out-showcased. I love the heat spot where Dennis sweeped out Ricky's legs from under him so Bobby could drop the elbow and then turn the match in the heel's favor. It was so innovative. Did I say sweeped? I meant swept. All right, somebody blast me in the comments section. I can speak proper English. I promise. I've read enough books. Anyway, well, the finish wasn't all too surprising. It did look like the Russians mistimed their cue, which probably did not make Watts very happy. I think what was supposed to happen was, right as The Rock and Roll hit Beautiful Bobby with the double drop kick, the Russians were supposed to be already in the ring to go after the babyfaces. The only problem was they were late by a good 10 seconds. Ricky actually had enough time to crawl over and make a count, which wasn't good, because I meant Bobby had to kick out of their finish in order for the Midnights not to get beaten either. And they've already established that as Ricky and Robert's finish. So they kind of killed their move. Bad miscue notwithstanding, Volkov and Khrushchev went after Morton by holding him down and then cutting his hair as a way to get some heat on themselves. Meanwhile, the Midnights had Robert Gibson pinned in the corner to prevent him from breaking the attack up. And then they all get run off by the babyfaces eventually. But, yeah, they cut Ricky Morton's mullet. And that, my friend, was a major crime back in the mid-'80s. Cutting a man's mullet was on par with arson and property violation. Possibly murder. You don't do that kind of shit, man. That's a 15-year sentence right there. You know how long it took for a dude to properly grow a mullet out back in the day? That ain't an overnight thing, brother. That's an investment. So you can bet the Rock and Roll are going to have something to say about this. And meanwhile, we'll keep the Rock and Roll Midnight feud on tap. Shouldn't have painted Khrushchev red, man. That's how it all started. With the babyfaces trying to have a little fun at the Russians' expense. Some harmless interplay. Oh no, it's personal now. And when we come back, we had a cool little surprise waiting for us in the ring. It's Jake Roberts getting ready to do battle here in Midsouth. Trying to recall, because I know we already reviewed Jake's run in Dallas a couple years ago. This would have been right before he went to work for Fritz, right? Because Jake spent most of 84 down at World Class before he came back to Mid-South in 85. And Jake was always in and out with working for Bill Watts through the late 70s and early 80s. Obviously, he started his wrestling career in Louisiana, being the son of Grizzly Smith, second-generational talent. I know I say obviously as if that's common knowledge amongst every wrestling fan in existence. If you didn't know, now you do. I mean, JR never mentioned it on commentary, but yeah, Jake Roberts was Grizzly's son. Hence the name Aurelian Jake Smith Jr. I mean, he had a good amount of success in Midsouth, even though he wasn't always around the territory for large stretches of time. Better use of him here than in Dallas. The Dallas run. I mean, I always thought Jake was heavily underutilized there. I mean, they used him in upper mid-card roles, but he could have done so much more. Frankly, you could say that about a lot of guys that went to work for Fritz at one point. I mean, this was just a short squash to get him over. He beat Jason Walker. Didn't really have enough time to showcase the classic Jake Roberts style that we all came to know and love. And they weren't even calling him Jake the Snake at this point. He was still plain old Jake Roberts here in 1984. I mean, I remember his run in 85 being a lot more prominent, mostly because he stuck around longer and had more time to establish his gimmick. But even just capturing a short glimpse of Jake in this 2-minute TV squash, or however long it went, you could still see what set him apart from so many of the other workers around this time. Not only the way he looked, in terms of size and ring presence, but the way he moved around the ring, the intensity he always showed. He still has the best DDT finish in wrestling history. Nobody could deliver a DDT like Jake did, man. It's like watching The Undertaker do a choke slam. Nobody did it better. And we'll have plenty more to talk about with Jake on future episodes. I want to move things along here, though, and not get bogged down with too much historical facts. I know I have a tendency to do that. Me and my ADD factual analysis of everything. Butch Reed and Buddy Landel wrestled George Weingroff and Lanny Poffo. God, the fact that they considered this a standby match, in my book, you could book this as the TV main event for a Raw episode and it would be a fucking match of the year candidate compared to the BS we get now. Great stuff. Reed and Landel are excellent heat magnets. I love how their entire gimmick is any opportunity we have to take cheap shots, we do not hesitate. We are bad guys and damn it all, we must cheat. It's the Bobby Heenan principle. Win if you can, lose if you must, but always cheat. My kind of dudes. So you had Poffo and Weingroff in control in the early goings, out wrestling the heels, and of course Reed and Landel are always bitching to the official about hair pulling or tight pulling or something. And fast forward where Reed has the ref obstructed long enough so Landel can pull Poffo over to the corner and then ram his head into the turnbuckle. Good stuff at the end where Weingroff got to run wild temporarily. And then Landel shot Weingroff into the ropes. Reed caught him in the back with a knee. Press slam from Reed. And a corkscrew elbow from Buddy for the 3 count. Nothing to complain about here. Other than me thinking about all the possible Butch Reed, Buddy Landel dream tag matches we never got. And that left just enough time to run a quick highlight reel of footage from... apparently this is a real place. Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And I actually looked up photos on Google Images. It is a real place. It's a cool little town. I think I read it's the 10th most heavily populated city in the state, with a solid population of just shy of 40K. So that ought to let you know the kind of activity happening in Arkansas. A lot of farm country out there. But they were in the heart of the city for this spot show. I think it was Joel that put together the footage here. There was a cage match with JYD and Nikolai Volkov that they showed a couple seconds of. The rest of it was just overhead shots of the city. It's always fun when you read about these funky towns a lot of the old promoters would run, especially the more rural areas of the country, places you could barely find on a map if you looked it up. And they always had wacky names like Pine Bluff or Bucksnort or, what's the other one I remember Jim Cornette mentioning on his show that made me laugh? Goose Creek, South Carolina. That was a good one. I mean, granted they were spot shows. It's not like they were dishing out top-tier cars for those fans. You gotta wonder, though, where do they come up with these names? It's hilarious. As always, Midsouth hitting bangers here in 1984. I gotta get a Sheamus sound drop so I can play it here. It's just banger after banger after banger after banger. I love the stuff that's ramping up with the Wrestling 2 Magnum feud. You know, they've started some on-screen tension between the Rock and Roll and the Midnights for their upcoming program. At the same time, they're also interacting with the Russians. So it's good overlap. No need to hotshot the blow-off anytime soon. The TV title tournament is slowly coming to an end, and it's not to say I'm going to be glad when it's over, but it is kind of reaching the shit or get off the pot status, considering how long it's been going on. But it's all about star power. It's a universal truth in wrestling that really stands the test of time. Even if the booking isn't remarkably great, as long as you have stars that are over, a lot of that can be overlooked a lot of the time. And we kind of see that with WWE today, even though it's not quite the same level. I mean, the TV product is boring as fuck, but they have stars. And when you have all your top stars interacting together on camera and cutting promos on one another, being the over-the-top personalities, there's always going to be an audience for that. Just discount those shitty wrestling matches in between. Nobody wants to see any of that. It's both true and kind of sad if you think about it. Boy, I'll tell you one thing that's very apparent with world-class rebranding in 1986. Bill Mercer's going to have a really hard time trying to get that world title situation right. What did he say here? The World Class Wrestling Championship Wrestling Association's world champion? Good fucking Lord, could you get any more tongue-tied, dude? By that point, you're going to run out of room for text print on the actual belt. I know brand changes are always awkward. Like, you mentally train yourself to say one thing, then you're supposed to use an entirely different name later on. It goes back to the whole thing we were talking about with Crusher Khrushchev. Like, I know it's Khrushchev, but instinctually I still want to say Darso. I just can't break that habit. That was good, though. I like that. The World Class Wrestling Championship Wrestling Association's world champion. And he did it all in one breath, too. Opener for the week was Steve Regal taking on Mike Reed. I think this was Regal's first appearance in World Class, right? I do need to clarify, because there might be a couple younger fans watching here and they might not know. No, this is not the same Steve Regal that you're probably thinking of, the one that wrestled for WCW in the mid to late 90s. Or William Regal, if you only watched him in WWE. Now, this is an entirely different Steve Regal. And I think he actually got his start in wrestling back in the late 70s. Had a pretty successful run in the AWA as tag partners with gorgeous Jimmy Garvin. Later on, he worked for Crockett Promotions briefly, which we did cover on the channel. He wasn't there for very long. I forget now, who did he team with there? Was it Jimmy Garvin? I seem to recall it was someone else, but maybe it was Jimmy. Because he didn't turn face until early 87 after they shot the fireball angle with Ron Garvin in the Midnights. And I think Steve Regal had already left the territory by that point. But they were still both heels at the time. I remember that. Interestingly, I didn't know this. He was born in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Did he ever wrestle for Championship Wrestling in Florida? Maybe he did some jobs there before he went to the AWA, but I don't think there's any footage of him working for Eddie Graham at any point. Someone can look that up. Anyway, it's a decent match. Regal is definitely working as a heel through a lot of it. Not a terribly exciting match, but Regal looked good. His work was fine. He put Reed in a cool-looking modified Walls of Jericho at one point. Wasn't the finish, but should have been. Crowd, I think, had a hard time getting into it. I think the biggest problem for Steve Regal is that he wasn't a big guy, and especially during an era in wrestling where the top stars were all broader in stature, it was always going to be hard for a promoter to book Steve Regal as anything more than a prelim guy or just a middle card dude. You know, again, he had moderate success as a tag team wrestler, but even when he worked for Crockett, I mean, he wasn't going to get tangled up in feuds with the likes of Ric Flair or Tully and Arn, Dusty Rhodes, any of the top guys. He had an okay look. You know, the standard bleach blonde mullet that a lot of guys were using around the time. Didn't have an amazing body, but he was in reasonably good shape. Again, somebody that had a place on the card, just didn't really have top guy potential. He ended up winning with a belly-to-belly. Again, fine debut. Regal wasn't the most boastful personality on camera, so it might take a while for the crowd to warm up to him as a heel. But we'll see. I assume he's sticking around. Now he came back for a special pre-taped interview between Bill Mercer and Chris Adams, and they were over in the UK. A casual sit-down at, I presume, his overseas home, although it could have been a relative's. Anyway, they're in the kitchen, going over the timeline and how Chris has been recovering from the eye injury. Since the last time they spoke, which was the pre-tape where Chris was leaving for the airport and had the two bandages covering his eyes, well, now he's regained his vision in the right eye entirely. It's a miracle. Now his left eye still hasn't fully recovered, but he's not given up hope yet. And that was kind of the main crux of the interview. They said up beforehand that the only stipulation to the discussion was that they couldn't bring up anything regarding Gino, which seemed a bit odd, but I can also understand not wanting to open that can of worms. And Chris had a message he wanted to relay to the fans in the States. While he's still not at 100%, and his family would prefer he stays in the UK for the time being, He wants to let the fans overseas know that the eye injury has given him a whole new perspective on life, and that he deeply regrets the way he previously acted. Which is probably one of the better face turn explanations we've seen in a long time. You know, the fact that Chris had something taken away from him that he took for granted through most of his life. It's given him a chance to reflect on all the previous horrible shit he's done in the last year. Not only turning his back on friends, family, and colleagues, but going out of his way to exploit the baby faces and trying to destroy their careers, damaging his reputation in the process. I mean, he's still not sure about the trajectory of his career, but now there's a hope that he can one day return to the ring. And that alone has changed his entire outlook. So, now it's in the hands of the Dallas faithful to accept the apology and welcome back with open arms. It was good stuff. I like the down-to-earth nature of the interview segment. It wasn't an overly scripted, overly produced segment. Just two gentlemen having a leisure conversation about a man's recovery and them wanting to see him get better. I'm not exactly sure how to take the Hawaii ball cap that Chris had on here. Of all the states, maybe it was a company brand. I never heard of an apparel company named Hawaii, but maybe it was a UK enterprise. Who knows? We had Buddy Roberts taking on the Missing Link, and that was after the Missing Link had upset a young girl and stole her stuffed animal bunny. So after Sunshine was able to get the Link to give up the pet bunny, she brought it out to ringside and tried to get Link to focus on the match. But of course, that ended up being the whole center focus of the match. It was this fucking stuffed bunny rabbit. I have no idea what his obsession with this thing was. All I know is someone tried to walk off with it at one point, probably to give it back to the young girl this fucking asshole stole it from. Then Link just ran up and stole it right back, brought it over to the timekeeper's table. So I don't know what was going on there. This whole thing was so stupid. Match sucked. Buddy got himself counted out intentionally. And then Link and Sunshine walked off with a bunny and basically told the young girl to go piss up a rope. That'll teach the young whippersnapper. Never bring your personal belongings to wrestling events. You might have your stuff get taken away by big scary clowns in face paint. I will never understand the Missing Link gimmick. Every single time he's involved in a segment, I just mentally check out. I'm sure Dewey Robinson was a nice guy, but he does absolutely nothing for me as a fan watching. I've never enjoyed any one of his matches. It's like the equivalent to an Ultimate Warrior for me. A big, goofy-looking, jacked-up dude with face paint that wrestles horrible matches and makes everything look phony and stupid. Fuck the Missing Link. Worst gimmick of all time. That led to a very weird segment following the break. So we've established the rules regarding the new World Heavyweight Championship, the former American Heavyweight Championship. Basically, the belt can change hands on a decision via countout or disqualification, even though traditionally that wasn't a norm when it came to belt decisions. Because in order for a title to change hands, the champion would have to be either pinned or submitted. Well, now World Class has instituted a rule where the world champion can lose his belt on a DQ. Now, obviously, the smarter fan of me talking is asking, does that rule only apply to the world title, or does it go for every World Class championship? I don't know. They never brought it up. But for whatever reason, the company apparently surveyed the boys to get their input because I guess their opinion matters. And it went pretty much as expected. The heels called bullshit on it because they're bad guys. Therefore, logic dictates they should be able to retain their belts at all costs. And the babyfaces are like, it's a change for the better. It proves who the better man is. No ifs, ands, or buts. I did like the clip with Rick Rude and Percy Pringle hanging out by the pool and sipping on their alcoholic beverage. I don't even know what the hell they were drinking. Some kind of cocktail. But Rude had the best line. He just goes, the chances of anyone beating me for the world title are the same chances of all the pretty girls that lust for my body. Absolutely zero. That's a man's man there. God damn, did he have a good body. And a lot of that kind of tied in with the TV main event for the week. Even though it was non-title. Kerry Von Erich taking on Rick Rude. I still have to remind myself the world title is literally just the American heavyweight belt. I guarantee you they didn't even bother changing the nameplate. It's a good thing they didn't have HD back in the 80s. Everybody would be pointing that out. So they kind of had a story going on in this match where Kerry had his left hand taped up. Supposedly he was attacked by the Freebirds in a parking lot outside some bar in Dallas. Of course, without actually seeing the footage, I just kind of presume it was Kerry doing something stupid and then he hurt himself. Bill Mercer was very upset about it, though, saying the Freebirds have stooped to a new low. I'm like, has Bill not been paying attention for the last 3 years? The Freebirds damaging Kerry's hand is nothing compared to all the heinous shit we've seen them try to do to the Von Erichs. And overall, the hand injury really didn't come into effect here. Rude cut off Kerry, kept him isolated on the floor. Percy was lurking in the backdrop, jerking his cane. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that. He was legitimately seen on camera giving his cane a cockstroke. It was very weird. It was good back and forth. Rude actually ended up targeting Kerry's back after he missed a drop kick earlier on. For whatever reason, Bill Mercer kept talking about the one-man gang and Bruiser Brody. It was like the entire conversation in this match. I mean, nothing against those two, but the hell did any of that have to do with what was going on here? There was also a weird setup to the heat spot right before the finish. They were trying to get in position so Percy could reach in and then hit Kerry in the hand with his walking cane. But it took Kerry and Rude like a full minute to get in position to set this thing up. Kerry's rolling around on top of Rude, changing body positions, and probably trying to figure out how to keep his hand in a vulnerable position without David Manning seeing Percy reach in. So they finally execute the spot, which leads to more back and forth with Rude going after the left hand. Meanwhile, Kerry had the claw hold locked in on Rude, so he was bleeding from the forehead. And they do a reversal spot where Kerry has a sleeper on Rude, and then he ends up intentionally grabbing Kerry by the hair and then yanking him over the top rope for the automatic DQ. And again, it's non-title, so Kerry doesn't win the championship here. Even though under the new world-class rulebook, the belt would have changed hands. It's a fine TV main event. Decent back and forth action. The hand injury really not coming into play until the end was strange. Like, you think that was a prime heat spot for Rude to work over for the entirety of it. Nope, he just ignored it. I'm sure it'll set up a rematch down the road whenever they decide to do that. Still got a bit of time between now and Texas Stadium. Overall, I can't say it was a bad show. And they certainly gave me more to talk about here than that forgettable piss break episode last week. I don't even recall anything that happened on the last show. That's how unmemorable it was. I think the Chris Adams news was the biggest news bulletin coming out of this week. But other than that, did the debut of Steve Regal, the missing link stole a bunny from a poor kid in the crowd, probably gave her PTSD, and Kerry, Von Erich, and Rick Rude had a serviceable TV main event. I think I could have just made that the entire recap, and you probably weren't missing out on much. But there you have it. And we will round out on that note. As always, I want to thank everybody for checking out the 5 Starr Wrestling Report. And definitely come back to check out Monday's show because we will have a fun discussion. It'll probably be one of the only modern WWE news bulletins I bother covering this year because it is both topical and very interesting. And I also want to have fun at everybody's expense because I think I know how this whole John Cena heel turn is going to pan out. And I think secretly everybody else does too. They just don't want to admit it out loud. But, well, we'll talk about it. I got notes. Trust me. This is not going to be a 5-minute discussion. Anyway, have a good weekend, everybody. And I'll catch you all soon. Peace out.